They ruled the world once empires so vast, so powerful, that their names were spoken with awe and fear. The Mongols thundered across continents. The Romans laid the blueprint for civilization. The Ottomans, the Abbasids, the Qing each believed their glory would last forever, but none of them did. One by one, they collapsed. Not always by sword or fire, but by greed, by silence, by refusing to change. In this video, we dive deep into the rise and tragic fall of history's greatest empires, not just how they ruled, but how they crumbled. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this: no empire is too big to fail. 1. The Mongol Empire, from dust to the greatest empire, and back again. They came from the steppe riders, born of dust and wind, cloaked in fur, forged in hardship, to the great civilizations of China, Persia, and Europe. They were a storm with no warning, no mercy, and no boundaries. The Mongol Empire, at its peak in the 13th century, was the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, swallowing kingdoms, cities, and peoples under one banner. But how does something so vast, so dominant, so absolutely terrifying, vanish into fragments? It begins with one man, Temujin, known to the world as Genghis Khan. Born into tribal chaos, abandoned and starving as a child, Temujin rose, not just through bloodshed, but through brilliance. He united warring Mongol tribes, not by might alone, but through a radical system of meritocracy, loyalty, and reward. In a world ruled by noble birth, Genghis chose generals based on talent, not title. That was revolutionary and terrifyingly effective. With steel discipline, innovative military tactics, and psychological warfare that sent fear ahead of their arrival, the Mongols crushed the powerful Qing Dynasty, annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire, and swept through Eastern Europe like wildfire. Their enemies were not just defeated, they were dismantled. Cities that resisted were erased. Those who surrendered quickly were spared and, often, absorbed. The Mongols weren't merely destroyers. They were astonishingly adaptable. They recruited Persian administrators, Chinese engineers, and even Venetian merchants. For a time, the Mongol Empire became a highway of ideas, trade, and innovation. The famed Silk Road flourished under their iron rule. But within the empire's very structure lay the seeds of its undoing. Genghis Khan's death in 1227 didn't stop the conquests. His descendants, Gedai, Mungi Kublai, continued the legacy, but that legacy was increasingly fractured. The empire was divided among his sons and grandsons into khanates, Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. On paper, they were one family. In practice, they grew into rivals. The unity that Genghis had forged began to splinter under the weight of succession disputes, cultural differences, and geographical challenges. By the time Kublai Khan declared himself Emperor of China and founded the Yuan dynasty in 1271, the empire had already begun to crack. The further the reach, the weaker the control. Communication between khanates was slow, loyalty was thin, and ambition was thick. Then came failure not of armies, but of overreach. Kublai's attempt to invade Japan in 1274, and again in 1281, ended in disaster. The infamous kamikaze or divine wind typhoons destroyed the Mongol fleets. Suddenly, the myth of Mongol invincibility shattered. Simultaneously, rebellions brewed across China. The once powerful Yuan dynasty became bloated, bureaucratic, and detached from the Mongol roots of mobility and adaptability. Corruption. Chinese peasants suffered under heavy taxes and foreign rule. In Persia, the Ilkhanate struggled with economic turmoil and succession crises. After the death of the last effective Ilkhan in 1335, Persia descended into chaos. The Chagatai Khanate broke into eastern and western factions. The Golden Horde, meanwhile, was slowly strangled by internal rivalries and the rise of Muscovy. And then, like dust in the steppe wind, the Mongol Empire scattered. No dramatic collapse, no final battle, just entropy. Local powers rose in the void. By the 15th century, the once great Mongol identity had been diluted into history, remembered only in fear, and what made the Mongol Empire fall? It was too successful, too fast. It swallowed more than it could digest. And without a singular charismatic leader like Genghis to hold it together, it became a sprawling body without a soul. From the greatest land empire in history, two fragmented memories scattered across the continents it once ruled. To the Russian Empire, frozen thrones and fiery revolutions. The Russian Empire, it stretched across 11 time zones and countless cultures, from the icy shores of the Arctic to the sun-soaked mountains of the Caucasus. For centuries, it was ruled not by politicians, but by Tsarsmen, cloaked in divine authority and absolute power. But empires built on fear and force are never safe from their own people. And this empire, so immense and unyielding, crumbled not from invasion but from the hunger and fury of those it ruled. The roots of the Russian Empire lie deep in the icy soil of Over centuries, princes consolidated power, pushing back the Mongol yoke and uniting Russian lands. Then came Peter, the gravitatowing figure who dragged a feudal, orthodox medieval Russia into the modern age. With a mix of vision, cruelty, and obsessive determination, he built a navy, founded St. Petersburg, opened Russia to the west, and declared himself emperor. Under him, the Russian Empire was born. It was a land of contradiction, lavish palaces standing over starving peasants, opera houses funded while villages froze. Russian identity was complex, deeply orthodox, yet westernizing, fiercely nationalistic, yet and while it expanded rapidly, swallowing Siberia, Central Asia, parts of Poland, and even Alaska, it remained fundamentally feudal, with the serfdom system chaining tens of millions to poverty and despair. By the 19th century, crux had begun to show. The Napoleonic invasion of 1812 was a rare moment of glory. Russia bled, burned, but survived. Yet victory didn't bring reform. The Tsars, especially Nicholas I, ruled with paranoia, stamping out any flicker of dissent. Secret police, censorship, exile to Siberia. But no prison can hold a nation's anger forever. Then came the mid-1800s. The Crimean War exposed Russia's backwardness. The empire lost to a coalition of European powers, not because of bravery, but because of poor roads, outdated weapons, and logistical disaster. Shocked, Alexander II abolished serfdom in 1861, yet gave peasants little land and heavy debt. The result? A new, bitter, landless class of rural poor. The Industrial Revolution came late and brutal. Cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg swelled with factory workers living in misery. Marxist ideas spread like wildfire among the educated youth. Secret pamphlets, underground meetings, talks of revolution. And then, in 1905, the people broke. A peaceful protest led by a priest, Father Gapon, was gunned down outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Bloody Sunday ignited strikes, riots, and mutiny. Tsar Nicholas II offered concessions a Duma, or parliament, but never gave it real power. The people felt betrayed. The final nail came in the form of World War I. Russia entered full of pride, but its army was poorly equipped, poorly led, and bled by the millions. Food ran out, soldiers deserted, civilians froze. The Tsar's leadership was seen as incompetent and worse, superstitious. His dependence on the mystic Rasputin, who seemed to control the royal family, became a national scandal. By 1917, the empire was a pressure cooker with no release valve. In February, a spontaneous uprising in Petrograd, driven by hungry women and striking workers, led to the abdication of Nicholas II. The Romanov dynasty, rulers of Russia for over 300 years, was no more. But the real fall came in October, when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power. They promised peace, land, and bread, and delivered civil war, repression, and transformation. The Russian Empire didn't just fall, it metamorphosed into something entirely new. The Soviet Union. Why did the Russian Empire fall? It ignored its people for too long. It modernized its military, but not its soul. It gave palaces to the few and chains to the many. When hunger met ideology, when desperation met revolution, no czar, no secret police, no divine right could stand in the way. From the grandeur of the Winter Palace to the gunshots in a Siberian basement where the royal family met their end, the fall of the Russian Empire is a tale of power frozen too long, until it shattered. 3. The Qing Dynasty, the last empire of China, and the slow fall of a giant. The Qing Dynasty was not supposed to rule China. It was a foreign dynasty, born from the icy northeast, established by a people the Chinese once considered outsiders, and yet, for nearly 3 centuries, the Qing would become not just rulers of China, but architects of one of the largest and most populous empires in human history. They would oversee golden ages, catastrophic rebellions, stunning, artistic achievements, and finally, collapse under the weight of their own resistance to change. It began in 1644, in the wake of another fall, that of the Ming Dynasty. China was already exhausted, torn by internal rebellion, economic mismanagement, and famine. Into this chaos marched the Manchus. They did not come as looters but as conquerors with a plan. They established the Qing Dynasty, positioning themselves not merely as new rulers, but as preservers of Chinese tradition. They adopted Confucian ideals, maintained much of the bureaucratic structure of the Ming, and even forced Manchu nobles to learn Chinese. But they also demanded loyalty in symbolism and in hair. The infamous Q hairstyle, where Chinese men had to shave the front of their heads and braid the back, was not just a fashion statement tip. Despite their foreign origins, the early Qing emperors were brilliant administrators. Kangxi. Under their reigns, the empire expanded into Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan. The Qing court became a center of scholarship, poetry, science, and vast bureaucratic control. Population exploded. By the 18th century, the Qing Empire was not only massive, it was the richest and most populous in the world. But beneath the glitter, cracks were forming. The 19th century brought a tide that China had never truly prepared for: Western imperialism. When the British discovered they could addict the Chinese public to opium, they did so with ruthless efficiency. The Opium Wars of 1839 and 1856 were humiliating for China. The once-proud Middle Kingdom was forced to cede ports, pay reparations, and allow the drug trade to continue. Hong Kong was taken. British warships sat in Chinese harbors as a reminder that the Qing had lost control not just of their borders, but of their dignity. But foreign cannons were only part of the problem. The 19th century also saw the Taiping Rebellion, civil war so bloody that it remains one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, with an estimated 20 to 30 million deaths, led by a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. The rebellion was not just a war, it was a social revolution, a cry from the starving and the poor. The Qing managed to crush the uprising, but they were never the same. The empire bled resources, lost trust, and exposed its inability to adapt. The self-strengthening movement, a half-hearted attempt to modernize the military and industry, came too late, and with too much resistance from the conservative elite. Meanwhile, more rebellions and defeats followed: the Boxer Rebellion, for instance, where a nationalist movement tried to expel all foreigners but was crushed by an international alliance. The Qing were forced to pay even more reparations. They were emperors in name, but puppets in reality. The court was paralyzed by infighting. The infamous Empress Dowager Cixi, a former concubine, who became the de facto ruler, spent vast sums on palaces and luxuries, while the nation starved. She supported conservative elements that resisted reform. Railroads, telegraphs, education systems. China needed them all, but the court feared they would erode traditional values and authority. By the early 20th century, the people had had enough. Intellectuals, students, and soldiers alike began to turn toward revolution. In 1911, after a minor railway dispute escalated into a nationwide uprising, the Qing finally crumbled. The last emperor, Puyi, just 6 years old, abdicated in 1912. The imperial system that had ruled China for over 2 millennia was gone. Why did the Qing fall? Because they stood still while the world moved. They failed to modernize in time. They ignored the suffering of their people. They clung to the past even as it dragged them under. The Qing Dynasty, the last empire of China, died not with a final battle but with a quiet abdication and a broken nation left in its wake. For the Spanish Empire, gold, glory, and the slow death of a superpower. At the dawn of the 16th century, Spain stood at the summit of world power. From the icy peaks of the Andes to the jungles of the Philippines, from the bustling streets of Seville to the wind-swept plains of Mexico, the sun quite literally never set on the Spanish Empire. They had discovered, conquered, and claimed lands far beyond what medieval minds had imagined possible. With sword and cross, they marched across continents. But in the same way a fire that burns brightest often burns fastest, Spain's dominance, for all its glory, was riddled with fatal flaws from the start. The roots of the empire began with Isabella and Ferdinand, whose marriage united Aragon and Castile. In 1492, they completed the Reconquista, retaking the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rulers. That same year, they funded a voyage by a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, and, in doing so, opened the floodgates to a new world. What followed was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. Spanish conquistadors, men like Hernan Cortes and Francisco Pizarro, brought down mighty empires, the Aztecs and the Incas, with a mix of cunning, brutality, firearms, and smallpox. They didn't just conquer, they dismantled entire civilizations. Gold flowed into Spain in unimaginable quantities. Silver mines and funded royal palaces, endless wars, and a golden age of Spanish art and literature. But gold is a poor foundation for long-term power. As wealth poured in, Spain neglected developing its own industries. Instead of building sustainable infrastructure or empowering a middle class, the money was spent on luxury and war. Spain became a battlefield across Europe, fighting Protestants in the Netherlands, battling the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean, clashing with England on the seas. The Spanish Armada, a massive fleet sent to invade England in 1588, was destroyed by storms. In the English Navy, a turning point that signaled Spain's vulnerability, religious zeal also played a part. The Inquisition drove out Jews and Muslims, many of whom were skilled craftsmen and traders. Spain, once a hub of knowledge and cultural exchange, grew insular and intolerant. Its leaders believed divine favor would protect the empire. But divine favor doesn't balance budgets or win wars. Meanwhile, inflation from all that gold and silver wrecked the Spanish economy. Prices soared. The crown borrowed heavily, going bankrupt multiple times. The peasants suffered. The colonies, treated as treasure chests rather than communities, began to rebel. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the empire seems unraveled fast. Enlightenment ideals, the American Revolution, and especially Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808, created a domino effect. Spain was weakened, humiliated, and distracted. Its colonies in Latin America saw their chance. Figures like Simon Bolivar, José de San Martín, and Miguel Hidalgo ignited revolutions across the continent. From Argentina to Mexico, Spanish authority crumbled. One by one, the colonies declared independence. By the mid-1800s, Spain had lost most of its overseas possessions, but the final humiliation came in 1898, when the United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War, taking Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The once mighty empire had been reduced to a shell. Why did Spain fall? Because it grew too fast, spent too much, and changed too little. It relied on treasure, not transformation. It silenced dissent instead of listening. It confused divine destiny with sound governance. And in doing so, it went from the terror of the seas to a fated power haunted by its own former glory. The Spanish Empire didn't fall in a single battle. It bled out slowly, painfully, decade after decade until all that remained were memories, museums, and a language that still echoes across the world it once ruled. 5. The Umayyad Caliphate. Lightning, conquest, silent collapse. It began with fire and faith. In the years following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, the Islamic world was in flux, growing rapidly, both spiritually and militarily. And in the midst of this explosive era rose a family from Mecca, once enemies of the Prophet, now claiming his political legacy. From humble beginnings, they built an empire in just a few decades that stretched farther than the Roman Empire had at its peak across deserts, mountains, and seas. But like many who rise quickly, they would fall not from the outside, but from within. The Umayyad Caliphate, founded by Muawiyah in 661 CE, after the assassination of Caliph Ali, was born in blood and bitterness. It marked the end of the Rashidun Caliphate and the dawn of dynastic rule in the Islamic world. For the first time, leadership was no longer decided by consultation or piety, but by heredity and power. Muawiyah established the Umayyad dynasty with its capital in Damascus, far from the Arabian heartland. From there, the Umayyads launched a military campaign unlike anything seen in centuries. They conquered North Africa, Spain, Central Asia, parts of India, and even advanced into France, where they were halted at the Battle of Tours in 732. Their rule encompassed Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, and pagans. This wasn't merely a Muslim empire, it was a mosaic of the ancient world, suddenly united under one banner, one administration, and one tax system. But with conquest came complications. While the Umayyads expanded territory and established infrastructure, building roads, minting coins, and codifying Arabic as the administrative language, they also alienated key segments of the population. They were seen by many Muslims, especially those of non-Arab origin, as worldly, even corrupt. The Umayyads built lavish palaces, wore fine silks, and often acted more like Persian kings than modest Islamic leaders. They introduced a sense of Arab superiority, granting privileges to Arab Muslims over non-Arab converts, the Mawali, who found themselves marginalized despite their faith. And then there was the religious fractured, deep scar of Sunni-Shia division. Shia Muslims viewed the Umayyads as illegitimate, usurpers of the rightful line of Ali and the Prophet's family. Every caliphate edict, every tax, every lavish construction was seen by Shia communities as another act of tyranny. The Umayyad massacre of Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, at Karbala in 680, only solidified this hatred. For a while, however, the empire held. The administration was efficient, the military strong, and trade routes flourished. But by the mid-8th century, the contradictions of the Umayyad system began to break it apart. Revolts simmered in Persia and Iraq, led by disaffected Mawali and those loyal to the Prophet's family. In 747, a secret Revolution de Abbasid movement erupted. It was emotional, religious, deep. The Abbasid, claiming descent from Muhammad's uncle, promised a return to justice, to equality among Muslims, to a caliphate led not by kings but by servants of God. In 750 CE, at the Battle of the Zab, the Umayyad army was crushed. The Caliph Marwan II fled and was later killed. The Abbasids, victorious, hunted down Umayyad family members and slaughtered them all but one. That one, Abd al-Rahman, escaped across North Africa and eventually resurfaced in Spain, where he established the Umayyad Emirate of later a caliphate in its own right. But the main Umayyad dynasty, the one that ruled from Damascus, was gone. Why did they fall? Because they forgot the roots of the movement they led. They ruled more like kings than caliphs. They built an empire, but lost the hearts of the believers. They favored lineage over legitimacy, and when they fell, it wasn't to an invading army, it was to a people who once prayed behind them, but now rose to bury them. 6. The Abbasid Caliphate, the golden age that couldn't last. The Abbasids came to power on a wave of hope for justice, equality, and a pure Islamic state. In 750 CE, after overthrowing the Umayyad, they promised to rebuild the caliphate on the values of the Prophet, humility, fairness, and unity. They chose a new capital, Baghdad, not just for geography, but for symbolism. It was to be the heart of a new empire, built not only with swords, but with minds. For a while, they delivered. Baghdad became the crown jewel of the Islamic world. Under caliphs like Harun, al-Rashid, and the Abbasid Caliphate entered a golden age, a time when scholars, poets, philosophers, doctors, and astronomers from every background flocked to the empire. The House of Wisdom translated Greek, Persian, and Indian works into Arabic, preserving and enhancing the knowledge of the ancient world. Algebra, medicine, optics, and even concepts of evolution emerged from Abbasid scholarship. The economy trade stretched from China to the Atlantic. Paper, gunpowder, and compasses entered the Muslim world through Abbasid ports and changed the future of civilization. In Baghdad, you could find Jewish philosophers debating Muslim theologians, while Christian translators copied ancient Greek texts. It was a multi-religious, multi-ethnic empire held together by tolerance, intellect, and shared purpose. But no golden age lasts forever. The very openness of the Abbasid system made it vulnerable. While the early caliphs held power tightly, over time, the vastness of the empire required delegation. Local governors, emirs, walis, and sultans began to act independently. Some paid lip service to Baghdad while building personal kingdoms. Slowly, the caliph became a symbol, not a ruler. Then came internal fractures. The empire was split by civil war between Al-Amin and Al-Amun, two sons of Harun al. That war didn't just kill thousands, it shattered the illusion of Abbasid unity. Ethnic tensions rose between Arab elites and Persian administrators. Religious differences became political weapons. Meanwhile, new enemies appeared. In the 10th century, the Umayyads, a Shia dynasty from Persia, seized control of Baghdad. They allowed the Abbasid caliphs to remain BTA's puppets. Later, the Seljuk Turks, a Sunni group, entered the scene and tried to revive Sunni orthodoxy, once again using the caliph as a The final blow came in 1258, when the Mongols, ruthless, efficient, and merciless, stormed into Baghdad under Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis. The city was obliterated. Libraries burned. Scholars were executed. The Caliph al-Mustasim was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The Abbasid dream died with him, at least in Baghdad. A symbolic Abbasid Caliphate would be re-established in Cairo under Mamluk protection, but it held no real power. It was a relic, not a regime. Why did the Abbasids? Because they tried to hold together an empire of ideas and faith with politics and inheritance. Their tolerance was their strength and their Achilles heel. They cultivated minds, but not enough defenses. They created a world of knowledge, but forgot how to guard it. The Abbasid Caliphate left behind no empire but it, left a legacy of learning, literature, and science that shaped the Renaissance and even modern thought. Their fall was not an explosion, it was a slow fading, like a candle burning long and bright, until the wax could no longer hold the flame. 8. The Roman Empire, the rise of order, the collapse into chaos. To speak of the Roman Empire is to invoke something mythic. It was not just a stat, it was an idea, a symbol, an identity. Rome was order in a chaotic world, roads in the wilderness, laws in the hands of mortals, but even the strongest marble cracks. Even the mightiest eagle must fall. Rome began humbly, legend says, in 753 BCE, with Romulus and Remus, suckled by a sheaf-off. But the truth was harsher. Rome was born in violence, expanded in brutality, and ruled with cold efficiency. It conquered the known world not by accident, but by strategy, engineering, and a fanatical belief in itself. From the Punic Wars to Caesar's conquests, Rome crushed enemies with discipline and absorbed them with cunning. It built cities, aqueducts, theaters, and walls. Its legions were not just warriors, they were builders of civilization. Roads from Britain to Syria bore the stamp of Roman boots, and Latin the language of law, poetry, and empire spread like a virus of culture. At its peak under Trajan in 117 AD, Rome stretched from the sands of Africa to the misty forests of Germania, from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. Over 70 million people lived under its rule, 1/5 of the world. So why did it fall? Because it became too big, too proud, too slow. By the 3rd century, the empire was over. Enemies raided its borders, constantly Persians in the east, Germanic tribes in the north. Internally, the empire was plagued by civil wars, assassinations, and economic chaos. Inflation soared, currency devalued, and corruption became a way of life. The division of the empire into East and West in 285 AD by Diocletian was meant to save it, but it was also a confession of failure. The Western Empire decayed faster, riddled with weak emperors and poor leadership. In 410 AD, by the Visigoths. Then again, in 455, the unthinkable had happened. The Eternal City had fallen. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain, just bureaucracy dying in silence. But the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, would endure for another 1,000 years, holding the flame of Rome until 1453, Yet even that was only a shadow of the Rome that once ruled the world. Rome fell because it trusted in its own permanence. It assumed that what was built would always stand. But empires are not marble, they are flesh and bone and will. Rome became a mirror of its own, mythologized, strong in stone, hollow in soul. What remains today is legacy, law, language, architecture, alphabet. But the empire itself? Gone. Not with a bang,